At different points in history, common languages have existed in the world. The first civilizations preferred the Phoenician language. After the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greek was spoken everywhere. Nowadays, English has become a logical solution to all questions in life, career, travel, study, or communication with people from different countries. Great Britain is a tiny island by the standards of the planet. But it is he who, by a strange coincidence, is always at the center of events. Therefore, the history of Britain is an incredibly interesting and useful thing for the outlook. After all, knowing her, one can understand why Rome fell, because of what the era of the colonies began, and how the United States was born. And so, let's go. And our journey will begin somewhere in the 900th year BC. DNA research shows that even so long ago, members of the Homo sapiens clan walked around Britain. It's funny that the prints of human feet found in English Haber are considered to be the oldest in all of Europe. True, from time to time people left there from the Ice Ages, which turned the territory into tundra. The island of Britain was not yet and was connected to the mainland by a kind of bridge, which scientists call Doggerland. The whole history of Britain in the Paleolithic and looked like that. During warming even Neanderthals came to live there, and during ice ages they left to the south. It is believed that our ancestors finally settled in Britain about 12,000 years ago at the end of the last glacial maximum. It was followed by the warm Holocene and the first permanent settlements appeared. It is believed that the representatives of the Crestvalian culture can be called simply Englishmen. Their life somewhere in the 10,000th year BC was similar to the life of the inhabitants of Northern Europe. But everything changed when 9,500 years ago Ireland broke away from Britain, and 8,000 years ago the territory itself broke away from Europe, turning into an island. Thanks to the good climate, people settled even in northern Scotland and were mainly engaged in nomadism and hunting. The first hints of agriculture and animal domestication in Britain date back to 4500 BC. The skin color of the inhabitants may surprise many. DNA analysis of a Cheddar man who lived during the secession of Britain from Europe showed that he was dark brown, with dark curly hair and blue eyes. By the way, the DNA of this ancient inhabitants of Europe can now be found in only 11% of the population. This is generally a funny story, because only 21% of the modern inhabitants of Great Britain have ancestors among the very first settlers who came at the end of the Ice Age. But a whole 51% are the descendants of the guys who settled in Britain by the time it became an island. Only the people of Wales have the largest percentage of native British genes. Well, from other news, somewhere right there in the 3000th year BC, the guys built Stonehenge. They began to mine silicon and actively trade even with remote territories. The British mastered bronze somewhere in the 2150th year BC. In 1600, tin deposits were discovered, which was supplied to all of Europe, which speaks not only of a developed industry, but also of the skill of building ships. Thanks to this, the migration process is continued. In York, in general, they found the remains of the brain of a man who lived somewhere in the 500th year BC and was a migrant from the Middle East. Well, the largest group of migrants, the Celts. Originating as an ethnos in Germany and France, the Celts settled throughout Europe. At the same time, iron processing technology penetrated from southern Europe into Britain, and at the same time the name of the inhabitants of the island. A funny story is connected with this. Caesar noted in his notes that the people known to the Romans as Gauls, in fact, call themselves Celts, and they, in turn, are called Britons by the inhabitants of other territories. In general, it is not realistic to make out who is Celt, who is not Celt, and this still causes heated debate among scientists. It is only known for certain that the name Britain was given to the people by the Greek traveler Pythias. He visited Britain around 325 BC and described its people as wheat farmers and merchants. After all, the island turned out to be terribly rich in minerals. As such, there were no states in Britain yet. Only in 175 BC in Kent, Essex and a couple of other areas in the south of England, large enough populated areas arose that can be considered the first cities. They spoke there mainly in the Celtic language, but you could meet both the Romans and the inhabitants of Germany, who migrated to Britain especially actively. Migration, and at the same time the rich history of trade of the inhabitants of the island with the continent, became the reason why Rome laid eyes on the territory. Historians believe that the last straw was the help of the British to the Gauls in their next uprising against Roman Empire. And back in 55 BC, Caesar took 2 legions and kicked the Britons' ass pretty well. After all, as we already mentioned, Britain was mainly inhabited by loosely connected tribes, and even lagging behind the Romans in technical terms. A year later, Caesar will inflict even more damage on the island, but after taking the contribution he will return to the continent. Finally, Britain will become a province of Rome in more than 100 years, but even from the time of Caesar, active trade and the actual dependence of the island on the empire of the continent began. This did not really affect the local residents. They had traded with the Europeans before, and the Romans did not particularly impose the language and culture on the conquered territories. Everything happened on its own, and by the 1st century AD England was Romanized. But not all of Britain, for the Scottish barbarians in the following centuries will drink well the blood of the Roman legions. And to repel their raids, by the emperors personally, real defensive ramparts will be built. But with the fall of Rome in the middle of the 1st millennium AD, the most interesting began. The very same Anglo-Saxons, the ancestors of a huge number of inhabitants of modern England, entered the scene. And according to tradition, that the Saxons are Germanic tribes. The very ones that became one of the reasons for the collapse of the Roman Empire. For Britain, this resulted in a similar conquest, which ended closer to the 7th century and ended with the Angles and Saxons conquering the territory of modern England. This, incidentally, is the root of the internal contradictions on the British peninsula, which persist to this day. After all, the Scots, Irish and Welsh were not conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. De facto, they are the undefeated descendants of the Celts, which gives them a reason to be proud. But whatever one may say, the Celts were still tribes lagging behind in development, and the Anglo-Saxons built as many as 7 mini-kingdoms in Britain, which later united, calling themselves England for the first time in history. Alfred the Great was appointed king of a single state, who was noted for having lost the first significant war. After all, at the end of the 8th century, the Vikings entered the arena, who first of all encroached on the sweet territories of southern Britain. The newly minted Kingdom of England resisted desperately. But in the end, a peace treaty was concluded, according to which London and a significant part of the land went to the Vikings. Only in 1018 will the British be able to take back their territories, but again Scotland, Wales and Ireland continue to live according to their own laws and principles. Well, a quiet life, without the attempts of Europeans to conquer Britain, did not last even 50 years. In 1066, William the Conqueror destroyed the Saxons at the Battle of Hastings. Normally duchy representatives from northern France began to rule England. Let some historians believe that there is no talk of conquest. After all, the last of the independent kings of England, Edward, was born in Normandy and lived there for a long time. Therefore, Wilhelm, who took the country, rightly named himself his heir and continued the line of succession. The period of the Normans is considered a turning point in the history of Britain because the British were on the verge of death. Anglo-Saxons were kicked out of the aristocracy, the English language was persecuted, and almost all of London spoke French. It is there that the beginnings of the formation of a single state on the island are located. After all, the Anglo-Saxons, shocked by the Normans, fled to Scotland and even Ireland, the independent descendants of the Celts, even though they were their own, and not newcomers from Europe, but nevertheless it was the Normans who laid the foundations of feudalism in Britain and, as such, a single state, chivalry appeared. The peasants were driven into dependence, and the royal power was strengthened and aroused fear. In short, the situation was such that the French ruled the country, but the lower strata of the population were Anglo-Saxons. And even when the Normans were expelled from England, the foundations of the life of society laid by them remained until the late Middle Ages. There also remained the classic enmity of the British towards the French, which, as you know, in the future will result in a dozen bloody wars, even within the country. The issue of cultural identity will be very acute in the coming centuries, causing dozens of devastating civil wars. But for us it is important that after the Normans, the Plantagenets entered the scene, who, ironically, were again French. The very surname Plantagenet comes from France. It was worn by the father of Henry II, elected in 1154. In the first half of the reign, Henry behaved well. He restored central power, imposed taxes on the feudal lords, and hired his army with the proceeds. Also, the English crown, through family ties, began to own significant territories in France. Along the way, Henry grabbed Ireland, but by the end of Henry's life, the legendary Richard the Lionheart took the stage. This is his son, who was noted for his exploits in the Crusades. The funny thing is that inside England, Richard was hated with all his heart and he is considered one of the most mediocre kings. First, while Henry was still alive, he forced the king to become a vassal of France and return her territory. Secondly, collecting money for the Crusades, Richard brutally took the last from the inhabitants of England. Later, when Richard was captured by Austria, the whole country had to throw off the ransom altogether, taking a quarter of the income from each. In general, the romantic image of Richard is not so good in reality. Only Richard's brother John could unwittingly make the situation better. During his reign, a legendary Charter of Liberties was created. This is approximately 1215th year. And another ironic story is connected with the charter. King John did not even think about creating it. In terrible dreams, he saw a free and not taxed to the very top, the population. The point is in the next toothless wars between the British and France, for which they again raised a lot of money, turned the Pope against themselves and lost mediocrely on all fronts. Tired of a beggarly life, the population, together with the barons tired of taxes and lawlessness, delivered an ultimatum to the king, in the form of signing a Charter of Liberties. It meant the possibility of punishment only after the trial. Delimited the rights and responsibilities of people and brought order to the chaotic state system of England. Now the king could not just hang half of the city or take property from his subjects. The charter will go through a thorny path, but its individual articles are still valid to this day, being a symbol of freedom and opposition of ordinary people to tyranny. Well, as for the Plantagenets, I don't want to describe further life and dynasties. This is a vicious circle of wars with France over territory, successive kings and attempts to violate the Charter of Liberties and internecine wars with barons rebelling against the crown. Kings drove out Jews, conquered Wales and occasionally saw good reforms. By the way, it was after the conquest of Wales that the English kings began to call their heirs Princes of Wales, and the tradition lives on to this day. Under the Plantagenets, a parliament was formed and popular rights expanded, but at the same time they got into the affairs of Scotland, where they got a kick in the ass. In its context, it is important to understand the main thing. Until Henry IV, who became king in 1399, all the kings of England were either French or French-speaking. Henry became the first king to use English as his mother tongue. But the Centenary War, for a second, began 60 years before the beginning of his reign, in 1337. And we can say that even if the two countries were at war geographically, but that the French were in charge of everything. In general, the term 100 Years' War is too loud. We mention that we don't want to describe the time of the Plantagenets, because this is an endless carnival of showdowns for power. Also, historians are tired of describing hundreds of conflicts between England and France, so they, not sweating, combined dozens of small wars into one big one, calling it a 100-year war. And as we have already mentioned, the war began not as a battle of two states, but as an internal showdown of kindred dynasties. It began with the fact that the English king, as usual, declared claims to the territory of France, and the French, in turn, made claims to the territory of England in Europe. The first stage, which lasted 23 years until 1360, the French lost with a bang. The reason was technical backwardness and the absence of a regular army as such. Everyone was for himself, while the British had long ago had funds for well-trained warriors. Charles V, King of France, shook up the army, reformed it following the example of the English, and at the second stage, which lasted until 1380, the British were smashed to smithereens. They were offended, regrouped, and by 1420 had taken almost the entire territory of France. The key to their success was the infantry, which drove out the expensive and small knights. The infantry is easier to train, it needs to be paid less, and a powerful force can be created in a short time. In short, France entered into a humiliating peace treaty according to which, on paper, English kings held the title of Kings of France until 1801. But this is only on paper, because in reality a weighty word was said by the French people, who raised uprising after uprising. You know very well one of the participants in the events. It was Joan of Arc, under whose leadership many English invaders were killed. Even though Jean was executed, the business she started ended in total success. In 1453, the British capitulated, losing all territories in Europe, except for the tiny port of Calais, which in another 100 years will also go to France. Well, what is important for us is that during the Centenary War, nothing has changed inside Britain. The population overthrew the Plantagenet dynasty by choosing Lancaster. Those, in turn, were taken up by the Yorkies, starting the popular War of the Scarlet and White Roses, which lasted from 1455 to 1485. The war consisted of a battle between two dynasties for power. Both were descendants of the Plantagenets, but the Lancaster had a scarlet rose on the coat of arms, and the Yorkie had a white one. The main reason for the Civil War was the surrender in the 100-Year War and the consequences of a long conflict that devastated the treasury. As a result of the peace, the territories of France disappeared, and with them the extra money. In short, for the Yorks there was business, the nobles and merchants of the south of the country, and for the Lancaster was the backward north and supporters of free feudalism. In short, the War of the Two Roses brought nothing but chaos to England. Every passerby called himself a king. At one time, the Yorkies seemed to have won, but they began to rule according to the Lancaster drawings. They were overthrown by their own allies. The Lancasters weren't allowed to really rule either. And all this was accompanied by the plundering of the treasury, new taxes, constant robberies, public executions and direct squeezing of territories. In general, such a classic feudalism. As a result of the war, both dynasties have exhausted their resources and their lives. As a result, Henry VII ascended to the English throne, who, being a representative of the Lancaster branch, did not bother and proclaim the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. It was from this date, from 1485, that England was transformed into a full-fledged state of modern times. Henry ended the feudal showdown, strengthening the central authority of the crown. Everything was served to the people under the sauce of stability, which the British, tired of endless wars, accepted with joy. In parallel, Tudor acted cunningly, shifting the focus from the shabby nobility to the bourgeoisie and the trading class. Business was given huge concessions and trade finally flourished. Henry financed an expedition to America and discovered Newfoundland, even if periodically, by brutal methods, the guy still gave people the promised calmness and confidence in the future. King's son Henry VIII continued the course of Daddy Henry VII. During his reign from 1509 to 1547, several events happened at once. First, because of the divorce from Catherine of Aragon, the king was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. This is also an interesting story directly related to the charming Anne Boleyn, and which Henry VIII later married, and even later executed her for treason. Well, for the country, this resulted in a reformation, because not wanting to put up with the power of the Pope, Henry proclaimed himself the head of the English Church. His daughter from her marriage to Mrs. Aragonese later tried to return everything, through repression, for which she received the nickname Bloody Mary. As a result, the English Church nevertheless became independent and Protestantism took shape in the country. Although Henry and Mary were marked by unenviable deeds, to their credit, they had little influence on the course of Henry VII. Fleet, trade and peaceful life continued to develop, and the apogee of this was the reign of Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Having ascended the throne in 1558, she spent 45 years that will go down in history as the Golden Age of England. Shakespeare, Bacon and Marlowe marked a cultural boom, creation of the East India Trading Company trade boom, and the victory over the invincible Spanish Armada military boom. Everything that Elizabeth touched took off, and even the Civil Wars traditional for England she managed to avoid. On the one hand, Elizabeth continued her father's course of reformation, and on the other she allowed Catholics to pray. Also, unlike most monarchs, Elizabeth did not pursue the supporters of the late Sister Bloody Mary. From the very first days, she behaved very wisely, and female serials will better tell about court affairs. And we will focus on the fact that under Elizabeth, the government allocated colossal funds for the purchase and construction of factories. The fleet that was lying around, useless to anyone, was modernized, and expeditions to the New World were sent one by one, including pirate ones, for Francis Drake, John Hawkins and other corsairs raped Spanish and other ships well, as if they had become independent, but in fact, receiving decrees and funding from the Queen. Under Elizabeth began not only the Industrial Revolution, but also the revolution of welfare. Ordinary people finally stopped eating from wooden plates, fireplaces appeared in houses, and glass became commonplace. But of course, one of the main achievements of the Queen is the victory over the Spaniards. Remember Bloody Mary, Elizabeth's sister? Her husband was the King of Spain. He offered Elizabeth a marriage, but she refused, exacerbating the contradictions, which were enough. After all, England and Spain were the most powerful countries in Europe. The apogee was the struggle of the Netherlands for independence, and where the rebels were supported by England, and Spain ruled the country. Elizabeth acted cautiously, but in the face of the threat of Spanish domination on the continent, she took decisive action. And despite widespread opinion, the Anglo-Spanish War ended neutrally. Of course, the British had a victory over the invincible Spanish fleet, but in 1604, after Elizabeth, her protégé Jacob was the first to sign an equal peace, for the treasury was still not rubber, and the defeat of the British fleet was also enough. But it is important for us that Jacob was the first to replace Elizabeth and began a new dynasty of Stuarts. Its distinctive feature is that Jacob was the King of Scotland and Ireland, for the first time in history, uniting all three crowns together. Unfortunately for the rest, that his son Karl did not learn the lessons of history. The parliament was dissolved, and the rulers naturally gathered power into their own hands, once again starting the process of destroying the population, which seemed to have passed a long time ago, and at the same time, the contradiction between the Catholic and Protestant churches, to which Elizabeth paid great attention, was scored by her heirs. The discord began here as well. The cherry on top was the king's attempt to crush the relatively free bourgeoisie and merchants. As a result, a combination of factors caused a revolution, which is often called not a revolution, but a full-fledged civil war. On the one hand, there was Parliament and supporters of the elimination of the church hierarchy under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, who wanted freedom. On the other hand, of course, the king, who wanted absolute power over all spheres of life. As it has always been in the history of England, the advocates of progressive ideas won out. Cromwell created a new kind of army, with pikemen, musketeers and cavalry, which twice humiliated Charles's troops. As a result, the monarch was executed in 1648, and England was proclaimed a republic. The State Council began to govern the country, which first of all expanded the rights of the bourgeois class, prohibited the church from interfering in politics, and even won a couple of successful wars, during which it was annexed, for example, Gemma. Only now there was another irony in the results of the English Revolution, for in the struggle against the monarchy Oliver Cromwell himself turned into a dictator. He dispersed Parliament at will and accepted the position of Lord Protector, which differed from the king only in name. In general, the system held out until the death of Cromwell, and after another period of anarchy, the Parliament and the bourgeoisie happily greeted Charles II, the heir to the disgraced king. He entered London with a solemn ceremony and the monarchy was restored, on the condition that Karl would not abolish the freedom of citizens and would not negate the results of the revolution. Guess what the restored King Stuart did? Of course, he executed former revolutionaries, abolished most of the laws and began to gather power again. His son Jacob too, as in the good old days, dissolved Parliament, causing another revolution. As a result, the British met with a standing ovation the new King William of Orange, who had arrived from Holland. The samsara wheel has given a turn. Parliament again received the right, believers received an act of religious tolerance, and the countryside calmly. But the main achievement was marked by Anna, the daughter of Wilhelm. It's not even about the War of the Spanish Succession, where the British snatched a bunch of colonies in North America and defeated France, becoming the hegemon of the sea. It's about the education of Great Britain. In 1707, the Union Act was passed, which finally united England and Scotland into one state. Well, after Anna, who left no heirs, the Hanover dynasty began. In 1714, George was the first to take the throne, and for the next 100 years, Great Britain was ruled by ethnic Germans who did not always speak English. And all of them were called Georgi, only the numbers changed. As in the good old days, under the leadership of immigrants from Germany, things went well. In North America, the colonies were lost, but Australia, Africa, India and other possessions only expanded. These Georgs consistently gave power to Parliament, expanding business freedoms. Therefore, Great Britain was one of the first to survive the Industrial Revolution. The British invented the steam engine, spinning machines switched to coal coke and factories sprout like mushrooms. It is important to understand that until the 18th century, England was an ordinary middle-developed country. It was during the Hanoverian era that the British began to supply the whole world with goods and produced almost half of the world's industrial production. From 1740 to 1850, the country's population increased threefold, and another important change that distinguished Britain from the rest of the world, the emergence of huge cities and urbanization. Well, along the way, the Georgi annexed Ireland, piled on Napoleon and built the world's first railway from Liverpool to Manchester. A train set off in 1825, which as you know changed the planet. Roughly speaking, it would not be fundamentally wrong to say that before the Industrial Revolution, England was a strong, but still an average state with its ups and downs. But after the country turned into a hegemon, which was especially evident during the time of the legendary Queen Victoria. She ascended the throne in 1837, and by the efforts of the Georg by this time Great Britain was already a constitutional monarchy, with a very limited power of kings. But despite the symbolism of power, Victoria put pressure on the cabinet of ministers with authority and was noted in history as almost the most beloved queen of the people. Under Victoria, the concept of the middle class appeared. Even in the homes of the poor began to appear, plumbing and sewerage. London has become the capital of the world thanks to the metro, theaters and business centers. Of course, one cannot close our eyes to the fact that in the Victorian era, the British raped the entire planet. They were conquered, India, Egypt, Cyprus, and resources from the colonized regions went to the metropolis on an industrial scale. This is still the subject of controversy among historians. Some believe that Victorian England owes its greatness only to the export of resources exploited from the population of the colonies. But there are also opponents who point out that enough of everything was produced inside Britain, and expansion is not the cause of development, but its consequence. It's not that important to us. The important thing is that Victoria has ruled for 63 long years. Queen Elizabeth, by the way, recently broke this record, sending Victoria to second place. By the end of the last Queen's reign, the situation in Great Britain was so-so. On the one hand, the economy was still flourishing, but on the other hand, Egypt, South Africa and other colonies, one after the other, rose up in revolt. And for sweetness, a big game was unfolding against the Russian Empire for the colonies in Asia. This story is for a separate video, but in short, the situation is similar to the Cold War, and many even believe that the revolution in Russia is the final court of a big game, because the British played it. The colony crisis made itself felt and Great Britain entered the 20th century on horseback, but a little shabby. You probably know the history of the First World War. England won here too. The country's Silver Age ended with the granting of the right to vote to women, the establishment of maximum working hours and the prohibition of child labor. Britain finally cracked after the world economic crisis in 1929 to 1933. A quarter of the British lost their jobs, industrial production collapsed and all national conflicts escalated. Under George V, who began the Windsor dynasty, the British Commonwealth was formed. It happened in 1931, under the influence of anti-colonial sentiments. India, Canada and other British possessions de jure gained independence, but de facto continued to be ruled by the Crown. Due to numerous problems, the British had no time for Hitler. The Chamberlain government in the 30s proclaimed the so-called policy of appeasement of German ambitions. You know perfectly well what this led to. But we are directly interested in the history of Britain, and everything went into a mess there. The colonies split off and a significant part of them refused to join the British Commonwealth on any terms. Gone, India, Burma, Ocean colonies, Ireland. Egypt was lost even earlier, and those countries that were listed in the empire have long pursued an independent policy. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Britain was not going to lose the role of the hegemon and continued to finance the wars in Korea and all the whims of the United States. This led to a deep crisis, from which the country was brought out by Margaret Thatcher. The Iron Lady has become even closer to the United States. It privatized the economy, reduced unemployment and lowered lending rates. But Thatcher was also marked by constant battles with unions and unpopular taxes, which ultimately led to her resignation. Since 1990, Great Britain has entered the modern era, events that you probably know. We will only note that the British Commonwealth of the former colonies has not gone anywhere to this day. Formally, the Crown rules both Australia and Canada and India, as well as the lesser-known ones, Mozambique, Rwanda, and South Africa. More than 2 billion people live in the community. It is very funny, in the context of history, that in the second half of the 20th century, France was actively trying to enter there, a country that has been at war with England throughout its history and even planned to unite into one state. But it didn't grow together. And the Commonwealth is now more of a circle of interests than a real state power. Nevertheless, it is foolish to think that Great Britain, with all its power and connections around the world, has passed the peak of its strength. For the history of this country demonstrates that from time to time the British are able to raise their heads and make a rustle. That's all, friends. Subscribe and like. Until next time.